Good evening, and welcome to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, the seat of the Episcopal Diocese of New York. I am Clifton Daniel, the Dean of this blessed place, and somebody was just telling me a minute ago, they said, you know, I have the best job in the world. And I thought, no, you don't. This is the best job in the world, to be part of this great cathedral that stands as a beacon to the city of New York and all of us as residents of New York, to provide a moral compass and to comment on the issues of the day, all of the issues of the day, racism, oppression, trouble at the border, and so on and so on. Part of our role is to address those pressing social issues that affect us all, some of them more visibly than others. And that is what we're doing here tonight with this great panel, about which we'll tell you a little bit later, led by Elizabeth Mara, who is Madeline Engel Fellow in Residence. No, I can never get titles right. Anyway, but welcome. And I want to introduce to you Bruce Mcleod, who is the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Cathedral. He is a graduate of Williams College, gained a Master of Business Administration from Harvard. He's on the board of the Posse Foundation, if you know what that is. And if you don't, maybe he'll tell us a little bit about it. Not tonight. All right, come back. And instrumental in Hudson Links, about which you will hear more this evening. He's a good leader. He's a great chair of the board, and I welcome him.
Can you hear me okay? So this is a great night for me. This pulls together two things that have kind of defined what's important to me in life. This cathedral, but more importantly, in some ways, my involvement with Hudson Link, which is how I got into the whole subject of incarceration and you know, what can we do about it? And I didn't know anything, and suddenly I found myself head over heels involved, and it's been 20 years now. And we have a lot of gratitude for Chris Flowers, who is underwriting tonight's event, but what you would not know, had I not told you, was he gave us a grant 20 years ago that actually launched Hudson Link. For those of you who don't know what it is, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it is a program for incarcerated men and women. We're in 6 institutions in this state, and we partner with colleges, and incarcerated men and women can get a degree, and when they get out, the magic of it is that they don't go back. If you know what recidivism is, it is the frequency with which people go back to jail once they get out. The national average is 50% or more go back to jail within 3 years of release. We have 800 men and women released, 17 and going back, which means it's a 2% recidivism rate. So it is a program that works, and we have examples of them here this evening. I see several friends who have been part of it, and it's a testimony to investing in people who make mistakes, because redemption is a real thing in this life. Tonight, in walking through the cathedral to get here, you may have seen the display, the exhibit that's here called Sanctuary. In the back of the room and out in the front of the cathedral is a booklet that will tell you about it. It's extraordinary, and I recommend that you do it. It has nothing to do with incarceration, but it has to do with life, and I would suggest that you take a look at that. There's a wonderful phrase, and I'm going to read it because I couldn't come up with it otherwise, about that exhibit. The concept and cornerstone of Sanctuary is the gift of basic human rights and the freedom to live in a community with dignity and safety. So that's the theme of that exhibit, and I recommend that you spend some time with it. Tonight, in addition to Chris Flowers underwriting tonight, the Episcopal Layman's group has helped us underwrite it. And if anybody's feeling really generous, you could also help us for the next program or two. There'll be 2 or 3 this year. And we appreciate all the help that we can get on that front. I'm not going to try to summarize the resumes of the people who are up here in front because they'll weave it into their own. But Elizabeth invited me to be part of this, and I'm delighted to. And I think you'll find it a fascinating evening. I'm going to be amazed if she can get through this in the time allowed. She's going to have to be a very, very good moderator in order to get into what everybody has to say and contain it. And to the 3 of you, I suggest mind your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Dean Daniel, for opening the program. Samuel Cabassa, Lanetta Hill, and Robbie Pollock. It's just really delightful to be here with you. Oh, is this not on?
It's not close.
Okay. All right. Let's just move. I think it would. Is that? Oh, you want me to hold it? Okay. Diane Wachowski is a beat poet from the 60s, and I have a book of her poetry entitled Inside the Blood Factory that was published in 1962. And the poems in that book have always remained with me over these many years. And as I was preparing for this conversation, there's one that I would just like to read to you, the first verse. It's called Rescue Poem. When he diagnosed my case, it left me with little hope. You have an invisible telephone booth around you, he said. It is the glass hard cardamom whispers cannot penetrate. Glass of cutout tongues and spider tracks, of the turn of a bolt, one thread, and of the distant one hammer blow drives a nail, the space of a snake's forehead, and the diamond ladder of a window washer, a shadow foot between the real foot and the ground. I think all of us at one time or another have had an invisible telephone booth around us. We've been in prison, confined, shut in, incarcerated. And I don't think there's any one of us who's not broken a law or pushed the boundaries of a rule or hasn't gone into a rage, perhaps hurt someone with or bullied them with words. But not all of us, we've been inside an invisible telephone booth, but we haven't been confined in a 6 by 7 foot cell, and we haven't been punished for infracting a rule by being imprisoned. So in the United States, I think you know that we are the country with the most incarcerated people. We lead the world. In 2016, an estimated 6.1 million people, that's 2.5% of the voting public, could not vote because they were due to a felony conviction. How did we get here? We got here because of the war on drugs. We go back to the Nixon, Reagan, and Clinton administrations. We got here because of politics. You remember when George Herbert Walker Bush was running for president, and Willie Horton murdered someone in Massachusetts, and he used that against Governor Dukakis, who was running against him, in quite an ad campaign. We got here through racism, and we got here through fear. And Michelle Alexander has outlined all of this brilliantly in her book, The New Jim Crow, and the paperback edition, which Book Culture is selling in the back of the room, outlines this brilliantly. I recommend it to you. If you're tracking social justice reform, you'll see that there's a lot going on. You read in the New York Times this morning about the First Step Act celebration that was held in the White House yesterday, and what's happening in New York State with the cash bail provision that will be probably dropped. This, of course, relates to the Caliph Brower case where he was convicted of robbery, had a $3,000 bail, was unable to make the bail, spent 3 years in Rikers before his trial was dropped, and he was released and then committed suicide. So we are going to just try to get through this conversation of what it means, both on the inside and transitioning to the outside. Samuel, I thought perhaps you could start, and we'll think a little bit about solitary confinement. Rick Ramish was appointed the commissioner of prisons in Colorado in 2014. His predecessor had been assassinated by someone who was out on parole. But Mr. Ramish knew that he wanted to do this, and he thought that he would like to try being in solitary. He was in solitary confinement for less than 20 hours. He wrote an op-ed about it in the New York Times, and he said, "Eventually, I broke a promise to myself and asked an officer what time it was, 11:10. I felt as if I'd been there for days. I sat with my mind. When I finally left my cell, it was 3 p.m., I felt even more urgency for reform." And in 2015, the UN, as part of their Nelson Mandela rules on how to treat prisoners, passed a rule that anything after 15 days in solitary was considered torture. So perhaps you can help us understand what it means to be in solitary and how you get there, perhaps.
I want to thank the J.C. Flowers Foundation for the opportunity that I have tonight to share my story with you and to educate you about solitary confinement and prison. Presently, I'm a certified recovery peer advocate at Bellevue Hospital. I also train individuals to become recovery coaches and peer advocates at Hostos Community College. And I'm doing an internship training individuals to become case managers. And the reason I'm sharing that with you is because I've done all this in 2 years. I was released from prison January 10th, 2017, after serving 34 years and 25 days straight for attempted murder on police officers, a wrongful conviction that I'm still challenging. In order to give you a backdrop on solitary confinement, I would like to put it in context. There's a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo, and in 1971, he did an experiment at Stanford University called the Prison Experiment. And a movie was made out of it in 2010 with Forrest Whitaker called The Experiment. And the reason I mention that is because solitary confinement probably wouldn't be as harsh if it wasn't for the attitudes and the behaviors of the correctional officers. Solitary confinement is a place where when you're in the prison population, you can be removed for disruptive behavior, for violations of prison rules, and you could be escorted there from any part of the facility, either with knowledge of what you did wrong or without. And once you're delivered, wherever you're removed from, you're taken in mechanical restraints by a team of guards and a supervisory sergeant. Once you get into solitary confinement, the solitary confinement staff take over, and They intimidate you and they threaten you, and they let you know that you're in their care, and that if you do not obey or abide by the rules, you will suffer physical harm. Solitary confinement, you have 23 hours that you spend in the cell, and 1 hour you're allowed to go to recreation. You also leave the cell when you have to go to a medical call-out or any other visitations, any events or activities of that nature. Other than that, you're in your cell 23 hours a day, and the hour that you get for recreation, that's not a given, because if the staff at SHU decide that they don't want to allow you to go to rec, they'll make up any excuse and they'll take your rec away from you, just like they take your food away from you, just like they take your property away from you. You're at their whim. And so in solitary confinement, anybody that's going there, it's almost as if you went to a doctor visit and you found out that you had a cancerous tumor. You know, you have to deal with this, and you become overwhelmed emotionally, psychologically, and you try and figure out what am I going to do now with this diagnosis. In the special housing unit, the conditions are so harsh that individuals develop insomnia, they develop what you would term clinical depression. And for the purpose of brevity, I won't give you all the definitions of clinical depression. Some of you probably already know. But that also leads to suicidal thoughts. And when you go to the special housing unit, you may go from days to decades without any meaningful treatment. And in New York prisons, 40% of the suicides take place in the special housing unit. And this has come from the Corrections Association Unit of New York, and it's based on data that was collected from the New York State Office of Mental Health. And in solitary confinement, you're isolated, and the environment is, I mean, chaotic wouldn't even scratch the surface of giving you a proper definition, because just like the officers have their problems and their issues, you have prisoners that also have many problems and many mental health issues. So it's just on a day-to-day basis, a lot of screaming, a lot of, argumentation, a lot of noise. You can't relax, you can't rest, you can't study. So you have to find some kind of a routine to try and get around it. And some individuals exercise, some individuals try and read. You're provided with a little set of headphones, and you plug it into the wall. You have 3 outlets. One is for the television station, the other 2 are for music. And but with all the noise that's going on, you can barely hear the programs that are on the wall.
Did you want to add something, Robert?
I'm hearing all the lingo. I never went to solitary, right? So it's it was always like the horror stories, and you like relate it really clinically and like professionally. I'm like, how do you do that? Because you let it slip a few times. On the wall, what's playing on the wall? That's like particular lingo that people know that in your cell, in many facilities, is often jacks that you can plug into. Before jails, prisons had TVs and whatnot, you could always plug into the wall. But also little terms like they could dead you on your rec. You know what I mean? Like that's the only spots in where you were like, because it hurts. Like not only are you in a really bad situation, but then it's like insult on injury. But I appreciate the way you expressed that. Yeah.
Lanetta, I'd like you to help us understand what it's like to be a mother. I know the way your son Prince, your beautiful son Prince is here in the second row there. What it's like to be a mother in prison, what it's like to leave children behind. But I just want to put this in a little bit of context for people who may not know that since 1970, the number of women in prison in the United States has increased 14-fold, from 8,000 to over 110,000. And like men in prison, they're disproportionately people of color, overwhelmingly poor, and the majority are charged with basically low-level property and drug-related problems. 80% are the primary caregivers and or single mothers. So what's it like when you're a mother in prison?
In my experience, it was just horrible to be away from my children. I think that's what kind of motivated me to do what I have to do. I also didn't do solitary confinement. It only took one time for me to go
You were
to
in
like,
Bedford Hill.
yes, I was in Bedford Hill Correctional Facility for 13 years. And why I strayed away from solitary confinement, because when you go to SHU, as you said, you don't see your children. And throughout my entire time being incarcerated, my main goal was to continue to have a relationship with my children. They were very young when I became incarcerated, and I built my life around prison to just solely to see my children. You know, like you said,
visit you.
right? Because when you go to SHU, you don't get visits. You get like visit every 30 days or something like that with the women. It's just a lot of rules, and I knew from the first time that I got myself into a situation that I wasn't going to do solitary confinement. It's really, really hard to be incarcerated and be away from your children. And I think that one of the most important things that I want everyone to know is about visitation and the importance of supporting the women in prison. Like, women make mistakes, men make mistakes, and you mentioned it earlier, sometimes you find yourself in a situation, and like I did 13 years, and I was in a situation, I was in a domestic violence relationship, and I went away for robbery, and I was like a co-conspirator, like co-defendant. However, I still end up with a lot of times, and I do take full accountability for my actions. And the worst part for my incarceration was being away from my children. Society feels like women shouldn't see their children. Like, if you really cared about your children, you wouldn't have never went to prison, you wouldn't commit these crimes. But sometimes you find yourself in a situation, like a domestic violence situation or substance abuse. And there's a lot of young women that's in prison too. Really like pressure, like peer pressure. I know that sounds kind of like awkward, but it's the reality. I am an older woman, I'm 50 years old. However, I was incarcerated with a lot of young women from the age of 16 that was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were with their partners, and they end up in a situation where they was in prison. It's also older women that have children that once ACS takes their children or a family member takes their children, they really don't want to go through the process of coming up to a prison and bringing a child up to a visiting room. So that has a great impact. And I believe that society plays a part in that. Like in Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, they have the nursery program. And the nursery program kind of depends on donations and people's help. Like my son here, Prince, in Bedford, they had like the summer program where people in the neighborhood would be like host families, and they had like the preteen program, all type of programs for the children to come up. But a lot of times, some people in the community didn't want to like participate in like the summer program. Your child comes up for a week, and they stay with a host family, and then every day the host family drops the child off, and you visit with your child, and then they come pick it up, and they kind of open up their home to the children. So we did have some supporters in Westchester County that would take our children, but it was a lot of families that didn't, where they would have to say some people couldn't participate in the program because there wasn't just enough homes for the children to be. So it's a great impact. Personally, like I said, it motivated me. It motivated me to do the right thing while I was in prison because I wanted to see my children. I wanted to parent from prison, which I did kind of successfully. You know, none of my children, they're all grown out, and besides Prince, end up in prison. You know, they don't hang on corners, they're not in gangs, and the visitation played a lot. Like on the visiting floor, you have to really talk to your children about what's going on the outside. So that's my experience.
Thank you. Robbie, you were working on Wall Street. You were a successful programmer. How did it feel when you heard the lock on the van door, and you knew that when you got out at the other end, you're going to be in a prison upstate?
Yeah. Told to turn my head with the mic when I turn. Thank you. I think how it feels is, I wrote a poem recently about what it takes to not care as your head goes into a squad car. How tough you have to be, what you're giving up to be able to deal with such circumstances. Sitting up here is not comfortable. Neither is sitting in a witness stand. Neither is sitting behind the desk with your lawyer who doesn't know you, who you don't know, next to you. All those are very uncomfortable job interview, also very uncomfortable circumstance. Sitting in a prison van with shackles, which are very uncomfortable, maybe shackled to someone next to you is also very uncomfortable. But I had lost my relationship with my mom, my dad, my whole family. I was alienated from churches and cathedrals and community. So, like you said, I was a programmer. I was making lots of money. And I thought I was cool. And I knew I was hurting. Like, literally, bars were my family. I was that guy spending money in the bar and thought he was cool. And it's a trope. It's really corny, right? And the irony is that my family looked at me as like, we did good. I was 23 before the first time I got arrested. And the neighborhoods I grew up in, that made me an anomaly. They did everything they could, like music lessons, after school programs, SAT prep classes. Yeah, I was the guy who was gonna make it. All the hope was on, you're gonna go to college. And I blew it. I blew it hardcore. So sitting in the van, for me, headed to prison, was a lot like, wow, I took my mama's effort and I played myself, basically. I knew the odds were stacked against me. I knew what it meant, but to some degree, that feeling was I was mad at me.
I'd like to talk a little bit about time. How do you think about time in prison when you're facing 20 years or 30 years or whatever it might be? Albert Woodfox, in his memoir that's just out called Solitary, and Albert spent 40 years in Angola, the notorious prison outside of New Orleans, for a murder he didn't commit. And he said it's important to have a routine in prison. You learn the routine, you learn the culture, and you learn to play between the lines. When you're confined and you're doing the same thing day after day, how do you think about getting through a year and 2 years and 3 years?
It's interesting that you say that, because I have a very unique story about time. So my original sentence was 15 years, and I ended up doing 13. And I learned to love my time. I really did. And it was weird the way that it happened is because I was in church one day and I kind of it was like a church group, and I kind of broke down I have 15 years. I can't believe this is happening. And it was amazing because it was like a powerful circle of women in this group, and they were looking at me like, you're crying about 15 years? And I was devastated, and they were kind of harsh to me, but it helped me. They said, I wish I had 15 years. I was surrounded by women that had life. I had one woman told me, 15 years, she said, I already did your time. While you're here, I'll be doing your time with you. And when you leave, I'll still be doing time because I don't know when I'm going home. And I remember going back to my cell and just cried and cried. How can I appreciate 15 years away from my family? But as you do time, you are around people that have life. And only through the grace of God will they make it out of prison. So, honestly, I took that and I was like, I can do 15 years. It encouraged me, I can do this. Because I couldn't see me never going home. Like, I couldn't fathom that. And I did get into a routine. Like, my routine was school. I did earn a bachelor's degree while I was in prison. I was telling someone earlier today, having a conversation in here, that they was telling me they support education in the correctional facilities, and I was letting them know that's a good thing. So I went to school, I went to work, and, you know, church. Like, I had a routine every day, and I embraced that routine. I embraced it because I was able, it's like they say in prison, you have a date. It's like a saying, at least you have a date. Some people in prison don't have a date to go home. It's like, I'm never gonna go home. So when it came to time, that's why I said that's an interesting story, because I had to embrace that time, and that's what helped me get through it.
Samuel, how did you deal with time?
My story is not as bright because I didn't learn what it was to be a responsible man till late in my time. Initially, I went up to prison with 38 years and a third to life, and I left behind my 6-year-old daughter. And all I wanted to do was continue to provide for her. So I was selling drugs in prison. I grew up in a community not so far from here, 105th Street in Columbus and Manhattan Avenue, and it was a drug-infested neighborhood back in the late 60s, early 70s, all the way through the 80s. And I played basketball in this cathedral in the gym downstairs when I was going to junior high school. So I grew up in a very tough neighborhood, and I went to prison, and I wasn't going to allow for the guards to intimidate me, put fear in me. And so I was always giving them a hard time. I was always championing the rights for prisoners that couldn't speak for themselves, lacked of education. You know, I believe it's like 70% of prisoners are high school dropouts. About 50% are considered functional illiterates. And so in prison, I was like one of the worst prisoners that they ever seen. I was high profile. Whenever I moved out of the facility anywhere, I had to be escorted by 3 guards, 3 to 1. I would be moved in a van by myself. The commissioner and the director of special housing unit, they all had meetings about me almost every day because I started riots, I started work stoppages, and there was a lot of stabbings, a lot of violence that I was involved with. And so I had to really find a way to change my life in there. And a routine for me was basically selling drugs and exercising, staying fit, because one thing about corrections officers is they're very intimidated by size. If you're really fit, and I was maybe twice the size I am now, maybe bigger than that, from calisthenics alone, and if you have a reputation for fighting, then they'll think twice about messing with you. If you have a good support group, other guys that are just as violent as you, that are just as recalcitrant as you are, then that gives you more reinforcement. So I was doing all the most terrible things you can do in prison, and basically litigating my case, because I'm a jailhouse lawyer. I've litigated cases in state courts, federal courts. I've won reversals in the Second Circuit. I've done my own civil rights lawsuit in the Western District, and won a jury verdict of $1,000 punitive damages for a correction officer violating my rights to file grievances. And so my routine was basically exercise, selling drugs, violence, and then I started going to college.
Robbie, maybe you can tell us what you did.
It's like I was afraid of guys like you. No. I was a punk. I rapidly discovered how few defenses I had, and actually I thought I was tough for a little while because nobody picked fights with me, and it was basically because really cool dudes who people respected really liked me for some reason. And it was like years and years later, I got a guy here in the audience who probably is one of those guys who liked me for some reason and is the reason I'm still alive. While I'm walking around thinking I'm cool. But for me, I think another formula, and it was a point of realization, was like I could read, I could do math, and I come from a family of teachers. So quite honestly, being patient with people, being able to see where they're at, work with them, and I didn't see it as like, I'm helping you, poor soul, because literally I'm in the same boat. We're all here together. So, I mean, I started practicing giving everything I could from everything I knew all the time, whether it's artwork or music lessons or tutoring or prepping or helping you write that letter to your girlfriend because she's flipping or whatever, like literally like all my time was, I had to learn to kind of like divide my time among projects because I was literally always taking on a project that involved giving to someone, and it was my safety. And I learned to really trust in that over time. It took a long time for me to give up thinking I was tough.
You know, this might be a good point, Robbie, for you to read that paragraph from last week. Robbie and I heard Kathy Bodine speak at the Housing Works Cafe. She spent 22 years at Bedford Hills and is now the co-founder of the social justice program at Columbia University. And she wrote an essay called On Being Human. And there's a really beautiful paragraph. She read all of this, but I think if you read that one graph about what it's like forming, after you form these friendships and relationships in prison over time, and then they're released, you lose that friendship.
This is the waving goodbye ritual?
Yes.
This is the waving goodbye ritual. We stick our fingers through the bars to say goodbye to friends with whom we have shared a life. I crane my neck to catch a last glimpse. The sun's rays bounce off the razor wire, row on row, circle on circle, silver gleaming. I wonder what happens to birds and butterflies. Do they get caught? Do our dreams? I can barely see my friend. Now I can't see her at all. My gaze is caught in the wire.
Let's talk a little bit about education, because the three of you, well, Samuel, you did get education eventually in prison, and I know, Robbie, you went through the Hudson Links program. Can you talk about what, some of the programs that you did?
I did like every program in prison.
Did you received your degree?
Yes, I have a bachelor's degree in sociology. I did every program. I did parenting from a distance, everything that has to do with parenting, everything in the children's center, I did. I did the puppy program as well, where you train the puppies for soldiers that have PTSD. So I did that program. I also was a teacher's assistant after I graduated college because, unfortunately, in Bedford, due to funding, they stopped the master's program. So after you got a bachelor's, it's like, if you have more time, you still, like you said, you have to involve yourself, help people, and do programs. So I did the puppies program. I did domestic violence groups. I did parenting. I did everything with my son. Prince here. He was 2 years old when I was incarcerated. And I was devastated. And the programs that I did to him, they really liked Prince. And every time it was time to go home, he would fall out on the visiting floor. I remember one day they came to my cell. Like, the visit was over like 3 o'clock. They came to my cell like 6 o'clock. Like, you need to be escorted down to the children's center. So I'm like, what happened? And he was like, your son is still in the parking lot. Like, we can't do it. I'm like, throw him in the car. So it's just, like I said, my whole time incarcerated, I knew when I got there, like I went through the little transition, that this was a place that I didn't want to stay. I seen numerous women get into fights and hurt people and get more time added on. My trailer visits, everything with my children it just drove me. It was like my drive to get me through the time. And college was one of them. I knew that I wanted to come home educated. And it was women there that didn't want to go to school. And I thought it was horrible. Like, I have a degree from Marymount Manhattan College. And it was $5 a semester because people donated money. And I couldn't understand why the women would not want to take advantage of that. Thank God I did. I got a degree. And I learned a lot, just everything about philosophy, hated it. Psychology, hated it. But I just learned a lot. Being in prison, it helped me to grow. It helped me to become the woman I am today.
Yeah, I just want to mention that actually it was when President Clinton passed his sweeping, crime prevention legislation in 1994 that the Pell Grants were stopped in prison. Mm-hmm. And so then it took a while for organizations like Hudson Link and other colleges and universities to bring education back into the prison system. We're running out of time because I want everybody to be able to ask some questions, but I just want to, since we haven't had that much time to talk about transitioning out, when you're released from prison in the United States, you face all kinds of rules and myriad of rules related to paroles and curfews and drug testing and meeting with parole officers and not being able to vote. In Norway, the social justice system is based entirely on rehabilitation. So there's no death penalty, there's no life sentencing. The maximum sentence is 21 years, even for someone like Anders Behring Breivik, who probably went on one of the worst rampages that we've ever experienced. Better out than in is the motto of the Norwegian Correctional Service. And this makes a guarantee to everyone for reintegration into society. And there's a safety net that provides health care, education, and a pension to all citizens. Do you think we could ever get there in the United States?
I'd say absolutely not, because the book that you quoted from, Michelle Alexander, I believe I mentioned that, and I'm very impressed that you got the book and you did mention it. The prison system, in my opinion, Michelle Alexander and many other individuals who study it, is an industrial complex. It's a prison industrial complex. The community that I came out of was riddled with drugs and violence. Drugs don't just turn up, on the corner like the newspaper where you pick up from the newsstand. And so because there's so much money in drugs and in incarcerating individuals, Corecraft is a company that provides jobs in prison for inmates to build cabinets, do clothing, mop heads, soap that then is sold commercially on the market. And I believe at one time, if I'm not mistaken, they were on the Forbes 500 list. They weren't in the very top, but they were up there. So just to be in the 500 is a lot. I doubt very seriously that in America, in the United States, anyone would do anything to stop the financial gains of the prison system.
I'm dying to say something to that. I think in contrast, and that's just touched a valid point, one of the classes I took as a Mercy College student through Hudson Link at Sing Sing Correctional Facility was Political Power in America, taught by Marjorie Ford, and I took it in 2008 after the big bank bailouts. Remember those days? Obama just became president, first black president. Yay, let's give all the money to Goldman Sachs, and so on and so forth. And I was like, wait, this is weird. And then the professor, who I actually had many disputes with, her name was Marjorie Ford, Dr. Marjorie Ford. And she said economics were, not a roadblock to political power for marginalized communities, namely communities that provide most of the people in prisons, whether you're black, white, other ethnicities or whatever. It's really about policing, and it goes beyond all the demographics that we usually think of. It's about thinking about human bodies and what they're worth. So the prison industrial complex is a real thing. Human bodies have value, like in the Matrix. You plug them in, they make you money. And we can take people from here, move them there, and distribute the wealth. Very simple concept. Everybody in here gets it. What I didn't get was what my personal accountability was in that system. I had grown up disenfranchised so much that I thought I had no stake in the society that I was living in. Like literally, I would sit out and see faces that looked like yours, and you would be a society that was separate from me. All of you wonderful white people, all of you wonderful rich black people, you were a different society from me. And I didn't see myself as having any capability to organize, change, affect change. And now I don't see it that way. I see us all as being kind of people. And it's because of Hudson Link, to talk too much. But I remember one day I was sitting there, it was like a graduation at Hudson Link, and like funders of this program, I was really cynical. I was like a real jerk. I was sitting there, I was like, people want to pay for me. Yeah, do-gooders. Yeah. And then I looked, and it was like this, old lady sitting there, and I'm like, she paid. She didn't have to pay for me to actually get a degree so I could stop being a fraud hacker and like have a real life that I could be proud of even while being in here. And that other person paid, and that other person, like, there's something, even if they're doing it because they want to feel good about themselves, they're caring about me indirectly. And that changed how I saw society. I can do that for things I care about. And so to me, I think it can change here. Absolutely. The old lady who gave money so that I could get an education and feel good about myself and have some kind of empowerment upon release, have these kind of conversations with people who can change things, yeah. And everything I do that's like that woman, yeah, we can change things.
Yeah. I agree. I agree.
Okay, let's open it up to questions. I'm sure that there's lots of questions here.
There's one in the back.
Hey guys, I'm curious to hear from you all. You spoke about your son being in the parking lot, and Robbie, you spoke a little bit about your relationship with your mother. How did you experience love while in prison? Does love fade? How does love present itself, or is it absent?
I can answer that question. A lot of women go to prison, they ain't gay. But once they in prison, they're gay for the stay, which is the term. And I think that some people find real love in prison, intimate love, and then I think is a means to an end, survival of the fittest. But outside of that, those shenanigans, I believe that is real love. I left women in prison that I love more than family members. And I can honestly say that because when you're in that society, it's like your own society, you learn to depend on each other. Like, you become a family. Like, people like, that's my daughter, that's my jail son, has to be a gay woman. That's my jail mother, that's my jail grandmother. And you kind of get a family there because it's so many people in prison that don't get visits, that don't have families. The family then wrote them off. And we kind of create our own love with each other. And personally, I think it's amazing. I think that one of the reasons I end up in prison, as crazy as it sounds, is like what Robbie said, so I can create change behind the doors. So I can be an inspiration to another woman, so I could encourage other women like me that was broken behind domestic violence, or young girls that was in prison and their mother was on drugs and they never had no direction and they needed help. It's just like a big community. So I believe that there is a lot of love in prison. It's a lot of hate as well, but my experience is I met some amazing people, and I feel bad I had to leave them behind. And some of them may never come home, but the love between us is real.
A difficult point, which Kathy was making, Kathy Bodine, that you really can have, by law, no connection with the people that you were with in prison. So not only when you leave, you're breaking a bond of family and love. Another question? Yes.
Sorry. At least two of you, if not three, alluded to what you were doing and what your lives were like before you went into prison. And certainly, you know, the issue of prison reform itself and the whole criminal justice system. But, you know, it really struck me is that how is it that we create a society that sort of steers people and a certain segment of the population into that? And what would have had to have been different in your lives so that you think that, you know, that might not have happened? You know, like you said, you know, when you look at other people, you say, you know, that's their world, it's not my world and stuff like that. And you're talking about, you know, the neighborhood in which you grew up in and what it was like and stuff like that. You know, each of you has a story, but what would have had to have been different in your lives and from what age that might have, you know, you would have thought about other options besides just survival?
Sam, do you want that one?
Thank you. That's a very good question, and I hope I can give a satisfactory answer. I don't believe that the environment creates the individual. There's been a lot of debate over individuals that are incarcerated, especially minorities, and they always say, well, the system's stacked against us. You know, that's why I'm like this. But I beg to differ with Robbie's opinion about that change can come about from Elizabeth's question, because when you go to the school system, there's a great scholar named Jonathan Kozol. He wrote about how the school system, he compared all the school systems from New York to Los Angeles, all 50 states. And he was able to prove that the money that was given to schools in minority areas was just a pittance. And so when I said I don't ever feel there'll be change of that magnitude, is because it's inculcated from the school system when you're in elementary school. In Jonathan Kozol's book, he explained how franchises like McDonald's and Walmart's have a say-so in the curriculum that's taught in our schools to our kids. And that curriculum imparts to these young kids that they should be a manager at McDonald's. So they dim the light on creativity and imagination and hope for these young individuals. What probably would have made a difference in me, I believe would have been better choices, because I had good role models. My elementary school gym teacher was the coach to Columbia University's lightweight football team. And he used to take about 4 or 5 of us after school up to the college. And, you know, we'd mess around with the college players. One of the year that I went there, the quarterback to Columbia University is named Marty Domers. He went to play for the San Francisco 49ers. And so he was a great role model. I had several good role models in the neighborhood, but I chose to emulate the gangsters, the hustlers, the guys, you know, with the flashy cars, with all the girls, with the nice clothes. And my father was an alcoholic. I didn't know he was an alcoholic till I started taking an alcohol and drug abuse class at Sullivan Community College, which was an associate's degree. And I realized that everybody in my neighborhood was an alcoholic. Every single family subsisted on alcoholism and gambling. And so the role models that we had from our parents, you know, when the welfare investigators came by, you know, if the woman wasn't married, the man would have to leave the house so that they wouldn't be there to report that there's somebody living there and they'll cut their benefits. So I believe that it's a choice that an individual makes, but the more resources that that individual has to build from and to make wiser choices is what will change a person's life. Because I had all the opportunities. I just made all the wrong choices.
One more question, yes.
I'm always fascinated to hear how contraband and drugs and weapons and things get into prisons. I actually had to visit a friend who I eventually bailed out of Rikers Island a few years ago, and the first time I went there, my underwire bra sent the alarm system off, and I went in and had to have a separate, almost full strip search. I mean, I couldn't get in even with that. And everything I had on me had to be put in a locker. So how do things get in? It's obviously a system.
The officers, the staff, they bring the drugs in. I mean, there's other ways like visitors. I'm not gonna not say like visitors don't bring it in when they visit loved ones. But I know in the women's correctional facility, the officers bought drugs. I had plenty of friends that used drugs. I had plenty of friends that was in relationship with officers, and the officers would bring liquor. They would bring drugs. They bought one of my friends a cell phone. Like, the officers, so they could come in even through visitors or through staff. No one wants to really say, oh, the officers are bringing in. But I know with the women, because the men was having inappropriate relationships with the women, they would bring them drugs and contraband.
Well, I feel that I'm an expert to answer your question. Speaking around, the reason I say I'm an expert is I served 4 years in prison from 1977 to 1981. And in 1977, I was deemed a contraband artist because I had 3 attempted escapes from Rikers Island, and I got charged with attempted escape in the 2nd degree. We used to smuggle in hacksaw blades. We used to smuggle in drugs. As Lanetta said, staff involved sometimes, but in the state prison, the drugs generally come in through the visiting. You can't expect the staff that's sitting, let's say, in a visiting room the size of this room, and they may have 2 officers sitting at the table in the front, 2 stationed in the back, 3 on either side, to be vigilant 24 hours, or the visit ain't 24 hours, it's 8 hours, but to be vigilant. So if you're good at what you're doing, you're either gonna set up a diversionary move to get the officers to look away while your visitor passes you the drugs. And the way that they get the drugs in is they keister it, like a suppository. They're put in balloons or any type of material that is smooth and would protect the drugs from getting wet. And so you do have officers and civilian staff, like many of you probably heard what happened in Clinton. You know, you had a lady that was working in the tailor shop. She was bringing in, you know, stacks of frozen hamburger meat with hacksaw blades in it. You know, she was gullible, but she was doing the wrong thing. So yeah, drugs are very prevalent in the system. Generally, they come in through a visiting room. A lot of times, not a lot of times, sometimes officers are involved. To answer your question, it's what Lanetta said in the female prison. She seems to believe it's normally the guards. In the state prison where I was, For about 20 years, I was the #1 drug dealer in all of the prisons. You know, I used to make moves, what you call moves. I used to direct traffic from one prison to 7 or 8 other prisons. I would have drugs delivered like FedEx. I can tell at what time my friend in Attica, while I was in Auburn, would be receiving his balloon with heroin or cocaine, ounces of marijuana. I could pinpoint it to exactitude.
I have like a further backup question on her question with this question. And I think for me, being slightly outside, I would feel uncomfortable, and I thought about it, having an ex of mine bring in the bag, as they say, bring in the bag. Because of the risk, right? So let's say I value my relationships with my significant other or exes or with another human's life, and I don't want them to go through what I'm going through. To ask someone to bring in contraband into the facility, we'd have to question why. I assume that when you went to go visit the person that you cared about them, that you thought you were doing a nice thing, that it was a nice gesture of kindness to go see somebody who can't do whatever. And there's some guys I know in the swing right now who'd be like, why'd you bring me down here on this visit if you didn't bring that thing? And like, they might literally call the visit off because the human contact and we have an idea about prisoners that we want to promote as like angelic, you know, poorly treated, you know, but the fact is that the value system that one develops, learns, earns in order to survive and thrive, like the one that Sammy's describing, he wouldn't even think about what the risk was to unless the visitor got trapped off, often a female visitor. Right. Or a guy or something. I'm sure you had schemes. I'm not trying to reveal all your schemes. I'm just saying that there's a difference between, there's an underlying assumption about why someone would bring in contraband. And it's the question we all ask when we say why someone does something against the rules or something consciously bad. Why did the lady help the men escape in Clinton? Why? And I think that's the heart of it. Why would someone do something so consciously bad for just a little bit of good, right?
I just wanted to say this, that like we're both right, but the difference between the men and the women don't get visits. Very few women have husbands in prison, and very few women get visits. When you go to a correctional facility for a woman, you see children on the visiting floor, elderly parents, you may see a significant other here and there, but when you go visit the men in the prison, their prison floors are filled with women, so that's why the women bring the drugs. It's really hard for, like, you could name the women. You could kind of like name the women that have a male come visit them in a female facility. Like we kind of like know, oh, that's so-and-so's husband, Mike, because the men don't come visit the women. Yeah. So they depend on the officers.
As you can see, this is a very, getting involved in this conversation can be very complex at every different level. So I think, Robbie, perhaps you can mention the book that you edited.
Cool, yeah. So for some reason, the company named PEN America, it's a nonprofit. They champion free speech. They've been around since the 1920s. Awesome organization. I'm their prison writing coordinator, and what that means is basically I run the prison writing contest I refused to submit to while I was inside because I was too cynical. And they offer cash prizes to writers all over the country, small honorariums to prisons, writers in prison all across the country. So there's drama, there's poetry, anyway. Their anthology of the winning work is in the back.
It's wonderful.
All the proceeds go to PEN America's prison writing program, where we pair mentors with writers. And I personally see it as a little bit of offering all of the writers who write with mentors on the outside, get a little bit of the glimpse that I did, that society is me. And I like to think that that's what I'm doing as the coordinator for this program at Penn, offering that glimpse to more and more people who want to write on the inside. Yeah, was that a good advertisement? I didn't, yeah, woo! By the book!
Samuel, thank you. Lanetta, thank you.
welcome.
Robbie,
You're
thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you.
We have a reception, and I hope that you'll all join us.
Thank you all.